Anthony Hopkins, the movie legend who will never die. In Britain and around the world, this is one of the most famous stories ever. In The Silence of the Lambs, he made Hannibal Lecter into one of the scariest and most haunting figures in movie history. His name is etched deep into the hearts of people all over the world. From a poor working-class family in Wales and a life full of fear and isolation, he became a shining example of art and discipline. A knight of stage and screen with an unmatched mind who changed not only the art of acting, but also what it means to be true and change. With an intensity and presence that were unmatched, he became the eternal embodiment of excellence. He changed what it meant to live within a character and showed that greatness can come from darkness so deep that it could have killed anyone else. For many years, he did more than just play. He told the story, the live proof of a brilliant talent that was honed in solitude, through addiction, and even in the ashes of fire. But behind all that bright glory is a harsh battlefield. When he was drunk, booze held him down so tightly that he was about to die. The sad breakup of family ties left wounds that never really got better, and the cruel hand of fate that burned down his home twice. Now that he is 87 years old, time and shadows are holding him tighter than ever. The storms he faces are stronger than ever. For many years, everyone has praised this talent. Many people are afraid to face the scary truth that has never been fully exposed. There are cruel shadows that can't be erased by 2 Oscars or a knighthood. Before we start, please give him a like if any of his acts have ever moved you or made you dream. It breaks my heart when the rise of a hero doesn't happen in glory, but in a heavy silence that makes it hard to breathe. Wounds were made long before anyone ever heard his name praised. That was the start of Sir Philip Anthony Hopkins. Born in Margam, a small town in Porttolet, Wales, on December 31, 1937. He was the only child of Richard Hopkins, a baker whose hands carried the dust of flour and the fatigue of long hours, and Annie Muriel, a gentle mother who bore the quiet burden of keeping the home steady. At first glance, they seemed like a normal working-class family. They were honest and kind, but storms were building inside the boy's head that no one else could see. Anthony had a hard time in school. Letters crawled across the page like stray shadows, making fun of him with meanings he could never grasp. His teachers told him he was too slow and let him go. His classmates saw that he was different. So, the boy pulled back, down into himself, and listened to the sound of his own silence. Years later, he would recall with piercing honesty, "I was hopeless at school. I was called stupid. I had no friends. I felt like an outsider." The sense of being unwanted, of being invisible, cut deeper than any punishment. Yet out of that darkness flickered a fragile light. With no brothers or sisters to confide in, Anthony built a world of his own. At the age of 12, he discovered the piano, its keys becoming companions, its melodies the only voices that spoke back to him. He painted with furious concentration, filling the silence with colors no one else could imagine. Art became not pastime but lifeline, proof that something within him was alive and worth saving. And then at 14, fate broke the silence wide open. He crossed paths with Richard Burton, not a relative, but another son of Port Talbot, a man who had walked the same streets, breathed the same Welsh air, and yet had already conquered the stage and screen. For Hopkins, this was more than admiration. It was revelation. Burton's success proved that greatness could rise from the very soil beneath his own feet. In that moment, the boy saw a door, one that led far beyond classrooms that had once made him feel small. A door into the world of art, theater, and destiny. It was a spark in the dark. A whisper that even a lonely, unwanted child from a quiet Welsh town could one day command the world's attention. The wounds of those early years would never fully heal, but they became the very scars that gave his performances their shattering depth. The foundation of a genius who would one day make silence itself tremble. From the silence of lonely classrooms, Anthony Hopkins stepped into the blinding lights of the stage. And yet even under those lights, the doubts of a wounded boy followed him like shadows. After graduating from the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama in 1957 and completing his 2 years of national service in the British Army, he entered the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. It was here that the boy who once felt invisible began to forge himself into an actor of terrifying intensity. But the journey was not gentle. It was a crucible. Each lesson, each rehearsal was a battle, and failure felt like a public execution. Hopkins later admitted that the self-doubt of his school years never left him. It simply dressed itself in new costumes waiting for him backstage. The National Theatre of Great Britain, under the towering presence of Laurence Olivier, became his proving ground. The pressure was merciless. Surrounded by giants of the craft, Hopkins often felt like an intruder, a pretender who would soon be unmasked. Each night demanded perfection. Each role was a trial by fire. And when the curtains fell and the applause faded, the silence that returned was cruel. Behind the glamour of theater life lay long corridors, dim dressing rooms, and the gnawing emptiness of a man who still felt like the lonely child from Port Talbot. In that emptiness, a dangerous companion began to appear: alcohol. At first it was just a glass to calm the nerves, to quiet the echo of doubt. But as nights turned into years, the glass lingered longer in his hand, planting seeds of a struggle that would one day nearly destroy him. Yet even in this storm, brilliance broke through. When Laurence Olivier, one of the greatest actors of the century, fell ill, and the young understudy named Anthony Hopkins was summoned to take his place in Dance of Death, it could have ended in humiliation. For most, it would have been a nightmare. For Hopkins, it became destiny. In a single night, the boy who once felt invisible was thrust into a spotlight that could have burned him alive. But he did not crumble. He erupted. His performance carried such force, such unshakable conviction that audiences were left trembling, and whispers rose through the theater world that a new titan had arrived. This was not luck. It was the fruit of years of discipline, of a restless mind that had drilled itself on every line, every gesture, every breath, until they fused into second nature. Hopkins did not seize Olivier's absence by chance. He earned it with every lonely hour of preparation. It was proof that greatness is born not in the safety of comfort, but in the crucible of pressure. And on that stage, the silence that had once chained him was broken forever. Cinema soon opened its doors. In 1968, Hopkins made his mark as Richard the Lion He Hart in The Lion in Winter. His performance, both regal and haunted, announced to the world that his genius could not be confined to the stage. And yet, as the world began to celebrate him as a rising star, inside he remained restless, still chasing the approval he had never found in childhood, carrying a hunger no applause could ever fill. The world saw triumph. He often lived torment. But from that torment, a lesson emerged, etched into his very being, that even the deepest wounds can be forged into power, and that sometimes the cruelest trials are the very doors through which destiny walks. From the crucible of the stage, Anthony Hopkins rose into the wide expanse of cinema, and the world could no longer look away. He made his mark early, but it was Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs that carved his name into the marrow of global culture. Hopkins appeared on screen for less than 20 minutes. Yet in those minutes, he redefined terror itself. Calm, intelligent, and chilling, his Lecter became one of the most unforgettable creations in film history, earning him the Academy Award and lifting the boy from Port Talbot to the very summit of Hollywood. The flashbulbs exploded, the ovations thundered, and the world declared him a genius without equal. But the higher the climb, the lonelier the summit, and the harsher the price. Success demanded endless hours on set, days that bled into nights, a body pushed to exhaustion, meals skipped, and sleep sacrificed to the machinery of fame. The world saw brilliance, but Hopkins often felt only the grind of a schedule that devoured his strength. He once confessed with brutal honesty, "Fame is nothing. Making it is not success. They don't fill you up." And when the cameras stopped, the photographs ceased flashing and the handshakes dissolved. He returned to a room that was empty, a silence that no ovation could reach. He admitted that fame never quieted the knowing doubts or erased the feeling of being an outsider. This paradox of being celebrated by millions yet tormented within haunted his brightest years. And it was in those shadows that the bottle, once a quiet companion, began to call more insistently. Still his artistry soared. Hopkins showed a range that few actors could touch. From servants burdened by duty to artists aflame with madness, to kings, priests, and ordinary men crushed beneath extraordinary weight. And when most of his peers faded into memory, he roared again. In The Father, at the age of 83, he portrayed a man unraveling into dementia. The performance was devastating, tender, and unbearably human, earning him another Academy Award and making him the oldest actor ever to claim Best Actor. In that role, Hopkins transformed vulnerability into universality, turning the fracture of memory into poetry. It was not mere acting. It was a lifetime of pain, discipline, and resilience distilled into art. Even television could not contain him. In Westworld, Hopkins embodied Dr. Robert Ford with chilling precision, proving that age had not dimmed his intensity. Each role was another summit, another mountain conquered, and the legend of his craft grew ever higher. Yet beneath all the brilliance, the paradox endured. The man who stood in the center of global admiration often returned to silence, the solitude of a room emptied after the cameras had gone. The flash of the spotlight could not banish the darkness that waited at home. And it was in that cruel contrast between the roar of ovation and the echo of loneliness that his most dangerous battle took root. For what the world hailed as glory, Hopkins too often lived as emptiness. And emptiness has a way of seeking its own company in a bottle. The world saw Anthony Hopkins standing at the peak of his craft, bathed in the blinding light of applause. But inside, another story was unfolding. A story drenched in shadows and silence. The emptiness that fame could not erase soon found its false comfort in the bottle. At first it was a companion, a quiet friend promising relief. But it became a traitor, tightening its grip with merciless hands. Hopkins would later describe those years as a blur, a fog that stole his memory, drained his strength, and blurred entire days into nothingness. He admitted with painful candor, "I drank because it was my way of dealing with life. I had no idea how to live." What looked like triumph to the world was behind closed doors, a man dissolving into his own oblivion. By the mid-1970s, the spiral had become merciless. Days on set stretched endlessly into nights, and when the cameras stopped rolling, Hopkins found no rest. Mornings arrived not with clarity, but with confusion. Memories fractured, hours missing, his body drained of strength. His health wavered, his energy withered, and the home he had built collapsed beneath the weight of absence and neglect. His first marriage cracked open, and the fragile bond with his daughter slipped further from his grasp. Alcohol was no longer an escape. It was a thief, stealing not just his nights, but his future. He moved through life in a haze of blackouts and regret, a man visible to the world, yet vanishing to himself. Then came one night, a winter awakening. He opened his eyes to find himself behind the wheel of a car with no memory of how he had gotten there. The cold reality struck like a blade. He could have lost everything: his career, his family, perhaps even his life. That was the bottom, the abyss staring back with merciless eyes. And in that abyss, he heard it at last, a voice within, faint but unrelenting, commanding him to stop, warning that if he did not, nothing would remain. In December 1975, Hopkins chose to stop. He walked into a support meeting, frightened, uncertain, desperate. From that day forward, he began the long road of sobriety. He embraced the fragile but unbreakable philosophy of one day at a time, clinging to each sunrise as a chance to choose life again. "It's been a miracle," he would later say. "I can't believe it that one day at a time I've stayed sober." The man who once felt powerless discovered a discipline greater than drink, the discipline of survival. Every day without alcohol became a victory. Every year a mountain climbed. And as decades passed, he guarded his sobriety with the same ferocity that defined his art. Yet the scars remained. The distance with his daughter Abigail, born of those lost years, never truly healed. Hopkins confessed, "I don't have any contact with her. She can do it. Life is life." That wound carried quietly remains one of the most painful reminders that even triumph over the bottle cannot rewrite the past. Still, he speaks of it not with bitterness but with acceptance. A sober man who has learned to carry the weight of his own humanity. Through it all, he never hid his journey. Hopkins has stood before others struggling with addiction, offering words not wrapped in grandeur but raw truth. That sobriety is not a conquest but a fragile daily gift, I'm just a lucky man. He tells them, I believe we are capable of anything, no matter how lost we feel. His survival became his message, his truth. The Hopkins the world knows, the knighted actor, the double Oscar winner, the legend, is inseparable from the Hopkins who staggered through those dark years and somehow found the strength to stop. His passage through the bottle into sobriety is not a side note to greatness. It is the furnace in which that greatness was forged. And it is why, when he steps on stage or appears on screen, audiences feel not just performance, but the echo of survival itself. What might have been a sanctuary became a house of fracture. The demands of performance pulled him away, and the haze of drink built invisible walls between him and those who loved him. While the world was just beginning to whisper his name with admiration, his marriage was unraveling thread by thread. By 1972, the union collapsed. But the true wound was not in the divorce papers. It was in the bond with Abigail. A father's role is to be there, steady and unshakable, a constant hand to guide and protect. Hopkins was not there. The little girl grew up not with the sound of her father's voice, but with the hollow absence of it, an emptiness so loud it echoed louder than any ovation. The stage gave him recognition, but it cost him the one audience that mattered most, his own child. Hopkins has spoken of those years with stark honesty, never dressing the truth, never offering excuses. Asked once about Abigail, he replied with words that chill in their simplicity. I don't have any contact with her. It's her choice. Life is life. No anger, no defense. Just the quiet resignation of a man who knows that some wounds can never be undone. Those words are not cruel. They are hollow. The voice of someone who carries the weight of an absence he cannot repair. It is a reminder that even the greatest actor cannot improvise love once lost. The abyss between them became one of the deepest sorrows of his life, invisible on camera, but etched into every silence of his private world. And yet, Hopkins has never spoken ill of Abigail or her mother. He has chosen not to reopen old wounds, not to cast blame, but to shoulder the fracture as part of his humanity. In that choice lies both tragedy and dignity. The tragedy of a love that slipped away, and the dignity of acceptance. His silence on the matter is not indifference. It is a recognition that life does not always grant second chances, and that sometimes the noblest act is to carry regret without passing it on. This first marriage was brief, but its aftermath eternal. The applause of the world could never drown out the silence of a daughter's absence. Fame could never substitute for the word father. And even 2 Oscars, even a knighthood, could not erase the truth that some wounds never heal. They remain raw, unhealed, unspoken, etched into the heart of a man who learned too late that greatness in art does not guarantee greatness at home. It is perhaps the most devastating paradox of Anthony Hopkins's life, that the actor who gave the world unforgettable characters carried in his most private role a loss no performance could redeem. And in that paradox lies a quiet lesson not shouted, not preached, but lived, that the cost of neglect is always greater than the prize of applause. It is sometimes the cruelest trick of fate that the moments which shine brightest at the start are those destined to fade the fastest. After the wreckage of his first marriage, Anthony Hopkins found in Jennifer Linton what seemed to be a lifeline, a calm presence, a patient hand reaching through the storm. In those first years, friends recalled a new softness in him. Hopkins smiling more easily, laughter slipping into rooms once heavy with silence. Jennifer's warmth steadied him, and together they built a home that, though simple, glowed with a fragile peace. There were no fireworks, no grand spectacles, but there was comfort in the ordinary. Meals shared quietly, evenings spent in calm, the subtle joy of 2 people choosing stability over chaos. For Hopkins, who had spent so much of his youth burning bridges and wandering through self-doubt, this was more than a marriage. It was a fragile redemption, a second chance at the family he feared he might never truly have. In Jennifer's patience, he glimpsed the possibility of a life finally anchored, a hope that this time, at last, he would not lose the love he so desperately needed. But happiness built on fragile ground rarely lasts. Hopkins's career soared higher, pulling him into long shoots, late nights, endless travel that blurred into exhaustion. The bottle, though no longer his nightly storm after 1975, left its ghosts, the restlessness, the distance, the walls he built inside himself. Jennifer endured it all with quiet dignity, becoming the anchor in a life that drifted constantly toward absence. Yet even anchors, when left in cold waters too long, begin to corrode. What they lacked together was not wealth, not comfort, but the heartbeat of a child. Year after year, the silence of their home grew heavier, the empty space at the table more pronounced. For Jennifer, the absence of a child was not simply an empty crib. It was a grief without language, an ache that deepened with each birthday that never came, each lullaby never sung. She had given her best years, her youth, and still had no small hand to hold, no promise of shared old age. In the privacy of trusted friends, she once confided that her patience felt like pouring water into sand, devotion without return, love that could not create life. For Hopkins, the void was different, but no less devastating. He admitted years later, almost with weariness, "I'm not good at relationships. I withdraw that distance." That retreat into himself was not only with his wife, but with the idea of fatherhood itself. The absence of children was not something he argued over or lamented publicly. It was something he carried silently, another echo of the loneliness that had shadowed him since childhood. Work gave him applause, but applause cannot replace a child's voice. Fame filled his days, but nights still returned him to silence. He once reflected that he often felt like an outsider, even in my own home, a confession that revealed just how wide the gulf had grown between them. So their marriage, from the outside so stable, was inside a house with walls slowly hollowed by silence. Love did not erupt in anger. It dissolved in absence. It was not betrayal or scandal that undid them, but the quieter tragedies, distance, exhaustion, and the unbearable weight of dreams left unfulfilled. By 2002, after nearly 3 decades, the marriage ended. Not in scandal, not in fury, but in silence. And perhaps that silence was the cruelest cut of all. To spend 30 years beside someone, sharing seasons, growing older together, only to discover there is no way forward. This is its own kind of devastation. It is not the sudden wound of betrayal, but the slow bleed of absence. A heartbreak that leaves no dramatic scene yet etches scars that never fade. Jennifer had given her youth, her patience, her hope. She had poured 30 years into holding together a life with a man admired by millions, but often absent in his own house. What she received in return was not betrayal, but solitude, the kind of solitude that hollows out even the strongest spirit. Hopkins, knighted and celebrated, stood once again alone, living proof that even the longest marriages can wither when distance becomes the only constant. This second marriage was not a headline-grabbing catastrophe, but in its endurance and its quiet collapse, it revealed a harsher truth, that not all tragedies come with fire and fury. Sometimes the most devastating fractures are the ones that fade slowly, almost invisibly, until there is nothing left to hold on to. For nearly 30 years, Jennifer Linton was the steady flame in Hopkins's life, keeping the house warm when fame and fatigue kept him away. But when that flame finally went out, it did so without spectacle, leaving behind not drama, but a silence heavier than grief, a silence filled with the unspoken ache of what might have been. There is a lesson in their story, not preached, but lived. That love is not measured only in years endured, but in presence, in nurture, in the daily choice to bridge the distance. Without that, even devotion measured in decades can dissolve into nothing more than absence. The end of Hopkins and Jennifer's marriage was not just the end of a union. It was a quiet reminder that time alone cannot save love, that without tending even the longest bonds may wither away, leaving only the ache of wasted years, and the cruel knowledge that some silences last forever. After decades of storms, broken marriages, estranged family ties, the long shadows of loneliness, Anthony Hopkins finally found what he had searched for all along. Not more applause, not another stage, but a home. In 2003, at the age of 65, he married Stella Arroyov, a Colombian-born artist whose presence was not heavy with expectation, but light with joy. She was not a remnant of his past, nor a chapter left unfinished, but his redemption. Where others endured his absences, Stella brought presence. Where silence once haunted his houses, she filled the rooms with music and laughter. And where Hopkins had so often felt like an outsider in his own life, she offered him the most radical gift of all: belonging. Their marriage was not painted in headlines or scandal, but in the softer hues of constancy. There were no children together, no second chances at fatherhood. Yet within that absence lay a quiet freedom. The freedom to love without the weight of what might have been. To measure happiness not in obligations unmet, but in moments fully lived. Hopkins has spoken of Stella with unguarded affection, calling her a source of energy, positivity, and balance. In her company, sobriety no longer felt like a burden, but like a celebration. Age no longer felt like decline, but like a season of peace. She did not arrive as a savior. His battles were already fought. She simply walked beside him, ensuring that he would never face the shadows alone again. For Hopkins, who once chased greatness as if it were the only cure for emptiness, Stella became the proof that greatness at home can be simple. A shared breakfast by the window, a walk in the garden where sunlight turned the ordinary into the extraordinary, an evening at the piano where Hopkins played not for audiences, but for the woman who listened with quiet devotion. He would later reflect that he had finally learned to be grateful, to treasure the ordinary moments that fame could never replicate. The restless ambition that once consumed him gave way to stillness. Painting in his studio, improvising melodies on the piano, speaking of happiness, not in golden statues, but in mornings that began and ended with his wife. This third marriage stands as the quiet triumph of his personal life. In a world that will forever remember him as Hannibal Lecter, as Stevens in The Remains of the Day, as the father unraveling in The Father, Hopkins himself insists that the role he cherishes most is simply being Stella's husband. There are no headlines here, no drama, only healing, only the calm endurance of love chosen freely and renewed with each passing day. And peace, when it finally came, did not arrive with fanfare, but with the quiet weight of meaning. The chaos and fractures of the past had carved deep scars. Yet those very scars taught Hopkins the measure of stillness. He knew what absence felt like, so presence became sacred. He had lived through silence heavy with loneliness, so laughter at his table became a kind of miracle. For a man who had once searched for worth on stages and in strangers' applause, Stella's companionship revealed the truest triumph. That happiness once nearly lost could be found again, guarded fiercely and cherished as the rarest gift. And so even the loneliest journey, scarred though it may be, can end not in emptiness, but in home. Fate, it seems, was not finished testing him. Even after sobriety, after love, after the peace of home, Anthony Hopkins was reminded again and again of how fragile safety can be, how quickly fire can turn walls into ash. The first time came in the early 2000s when his London home was reduced to embers. Flames rose without warning, racing across beams and ceilings before anyone could react. In less than an hour, what had taken decades to gather, furniture worn by use, rare paintings collected with care, beloved books heavy with notes, photographs yellowed by time. The small tokens of memory that make a house a life was devoured. The loss was counted not only in millions of pounds, but in the vanished weight of a lifetime reduced to smoke. Neighbors spoke of the sky blackened with ash, of sparks dancing in the wind like cruel fireworks. Hopkins stood in disbelief, staring at the embers of his own history, stunned by the cruelty of seeing his home turned into a graveyard of memories. That alone would have been enough. One inferno to scar a lifetime, one night to etch fire into memory forever. But fate was merciless. In 2018, as wildfires tore through Southern California, flames licked dangerously close to another of his homes, a near miss that felt like destiny, reminding him of its power. And then in 2025, the nightmare returned in full. At Pacific Palisades, his sanctuary was consumed completely. Once again, flames surged, unstoppable, erasing not just walls and ceilings, but the fragile sense of permanence he had tried so carefully to rebuild. To lose a house once was agony. To lose it twice was devastation beyond words. Hopkins could only watch as walls collapsed, and heirlooms shattered in the fire's roar, as if the universe itself were mocking his efforts to hold on to peace. Family treasures, carefully framed scripts, awards, and letters, all gone in a storm of heat and smoke. What remained was silence, but not the silence of loneliness he had once known, the kind that gnawed in his youth and echoed through failed marriages. This was heavier, a silence of absence, of spaces reduced to soot, of rooms echoing only with ghosts of memory. 3 times fire had threatened. Twice it had taken everything, and twice he was forced to stand in the ashes to face the unbearable truth that even the strongest walls can vanish in a breath of flame. For most, a house is only wood and brick. For Hopkins, it was more. It was the canvas on which he painted his second chances, the stage where sobriety grew steadier, the place where ordinary evenings carried the weight of healing. To lose it once was cruel enough. To stand again before a second fire, watching the roof collapse and the walls crumble as if fate itself were erasing the life he had fought so hard to rebuild, was almost unbearable. He admitted later to the surreal weight of it, how everything from treasured scripts to family heirlooms could vanish in an instant, leaving behind a man stripped bare. And yet in that devastation, there was also clarity. He remembered the smoke choking the air, the frantic rush into the night, the pounding of his own heart as he stumbled into the open, shaken, but alive. It was all gone, he recalled, not with bitterness, but with an acceptance forged in scars. Things can be replaced. Life cannot. He was left staring at the ashes with the heavy awareness that though memory had burned, life itself had been spared. It is easy to measure success in trophies or houses, but Hopkins's story of fire reveals another kind of truth. Again and again, he saw what most fear most, the destruction of home, the obliteration of memory and flame. And again he stood in the ashes, breathing and able to begin again. The man who had once nearly surrendered to the bottle now faced loss with a strange calm, a wisdom tempered by scars. To Hopkins, the fires were not merely tragedies. They were reminders that applause fades, that walls fall, that possessions vanish. But what endures is life itself and the will to rise again. And so though his homes were taken, Hopkins himself remained unshaken. He rebuilt. He continued. He lived. And when Stella later came into his life, he refused to let fire define him, just as he had once refused to let addiction or despair dictate his ending. For if the stage had taught him anything, it was this: even when curtains fall, another act begins. And from the ashes, he chose to stand, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for love, for the chance once more to keep going. Some losses do not come in flames, but in silence. The silence of a hospital room, the silence of an empty chair at the family table. For Anthony Hopkins, the deepest wounds were not carved by fire, but by the absence of the 2 people who had first given him life. When his father, Richard, passed, the man whose flour-stained hands had carried bread through the streets of Wales, Hopkins called it the worst thing that ever happened to me. He remembered sitting by the bedside, watching the strength in those hands slip away, powerless to stop time. It was not merely death he mourned, but the vanishing of a presence that had anchored his childhood. No stage, no applause, no knighthood could protect him from the sight of his father fading. A reminder that even giants must bow before time. Years later, when his mother, Muriel, followed, the last bridge to his youth collapsed. Returning to her empty home, he admitted it felt as though the walls themselves no longer recognized him. With her went the final echo of home. He confessed that grief left him hollow, that even as the world hailed him as a legend, he felt like a man untethered with no one left to call him son. These losses were not loud, not public. They were the kind of scars that live in silence, and they linger in every role where Hopkins plays a man, undone by memory, love, or time. And then came the slowest loss of all, the body itself. Now at 87, Hopkins carries the unrelenting truth that age spares no one. He has spoken of memory faltering, of names and faces hovering at the edge of forgetting. That fear found its most haunting expression in The Father, where he portrayed a man descending into dementia. Audiences wept because it felt unbearably real, and in part it was. Hopkins poured into that role not just craft, but the dread of a man who knows the stage inside his own skull may one day go dark. Age has brought its toll. The slowing heart, the aching bones, the solitude of mornings when the mirror no longer reflects Hannibal Lecter or Stevens, but a fragile, finite old man. At times he sits before the piano, fingers hesitating on familiar keys, as if music itself were testing his memory. For someone who once commanded worlds on screen, the confrontation with his own frailty has been the cruelest script of all. And yet Hopkins has refused to answer with despair. Instead, he has chosen a defiant kind of peace. He paints in his studio, plays the piano in quiet hours, walks slowly through gardens with Stella at his side. He speaks often of gratitude. Gratitude for a sunrise, a shared meal, the chance to breathe another day. The shadows remain, of course. The absence of his parents still weighs on him, and the specter of age never leaves his shoulder. But he does not flee from these truths. Life is very short, he once said simply, with the calm of a man who has seen too much to deny it. This perhaps is the final paradox of Anthony Hopkins, that the man celebrated as one of the greatest actors of all time is at the core a man who has outlived the voices that once called him son, an old soul measuring time in days. And yet he endures through fire, through grief, through the betrayals of his own body. He has learned that even silence can hold meaning. His story is not only of genius and glory. It is of survival, of rising again and again in the face of loss and still choosing to live. The curtain may fall, but Hopkins, ever the actor, has shown the world how to bow to darkness and then step once more into the light. Now at 87, Anthony Hopkins lives not on the stage or in the glare of cameras, but in the quiet rhythm of a life he has fought hard to preserve. After the storms of broken marriages, the abyss of addiction, the flames that twice consumed his homes, and the silences of grief, he has built a present defined not by chaos, but by calm. He resides in the United States with his wife Stella Arroyav, the partner who has stood beside him for more than 2 decades. Together they have created a life of simplicity and resilience, even after the fire of early 2025 forced them once more to rebuild. Hopkins no longer seeks the noise of Hollywood. He seeks privacy, stability, and the laughter that fills his home in the evenings. His outside wealth, by many public estimates, is substantial. His net worth is often cited around $160 million. Driven not just by decades of award-winning performances, but also by strategic investments in real estate. He once owned a Malibu estate, a Cape Cod-style home with 5 bedrooms, a guest house, pool house perched on a bluff above the Pacific that was later sold for roughly $10.5 million. In Pacific Palisades, he held a primary residence estimated at $7 million and owned neighboring properties, including a 1940s colonial home bought around 2019 for about $6 million under house and lot values reported. His real estate portfolio in Los Angeles alone is reported to be worth tens of millions among his most visible assets. And yet, despite the numbers, Hopkins treats these not as trophies, but as tools of stability and symbols of impermanence. Fire has shown him that even the grandest walls can fall. He does not flaunt his wealth. He allows his art, his company, and his home's quiet to speak instead. The true measure of what he owns lies less in valuations and more in the moments he breathes freely, in the art he continues to make, and in the love he shares. His health, though marked by age, is tended with the same discipline that once shaped his greatest roles. He submits to regular checkups, avoids sugar, sleeps early, and honors the vow of sobriety he made in 1975. A vow that has now outlived entire generations of applause. Music and painting remain his daily therapy. At the piano, his fingers wander across melodies like old companions. In his studio, canvases bloom with color, each brushstroke a quiet dialogue with silence. He accepts the frailty of time, the aching knees, the slower step, but he meets it with dignity. Life is very short, he has often said, and in that brevity, he has found not despair, but urgency, a reason to treasure each dawn as a gift, never a guarantee. When he steps into public view, rarely now, he does so with a presence that stops time. At premieres, at exhibitions, At moments of charity, his silver hair and serene gaze radiate something greater than fame, a majesty born of survival. No longer a man chasing roles, he chooses them like heirlooms, each one an offering, a voice that breathes life into animation, a script that stirs his spirit, a memoir in the making. His art on screen, in music, on canvas, remains his bridge to the world. And behind the public image lies simplicity, a meal shared with Stella, a walk in the garden, mornings filled with sunlight instead of flashbulbs. Still the shadows never fully vanish. The ashes of burned homes, the fracture with his daughter, the silence left by his parents, these remain. But Hopkins no longer allows them to devour him. He has turned pain into discipline, loss into resilience, solitude into creation. His life today proves that scars can become blueprints, that brokenness can give birth to beauty, and that peace, though fragile, is still possible. If his present is one of calm, his legacy is carved in fire and stone. 2 Academy Awards, BAFTAs, Emmys, Olivier Awards. His name etched across every stage and screen. A knighthood from the Queen. The record as the oldest man to win the Oscar for Best Actor. Yet beyond the trophies lies something harder to measure. The weight of performances that unsettled, comforted, and transformed entire generations. From the flower-stained hands of his baker father in Wales to the piercing eyes of Hannibal Lecter, his journey is a perfect circle. The labor of ordinary hands reborn as extraordinary art. He may hold passports from both Britain and the United States, but in truth, he belongs to no single country. His home is wherever there is a piano, a canvas, or a story worth telling. Now at 87, Anthony Hopkins stands not merely as a legend of acting, but as a survivor, a man who turned addiction into sobriety, loss into gratitude, silence into music, fragility into strength. His story is not only one of genius, but of endurance, proof that even when the curtain falls, another act can begin. And if his films have ever pierced your heart, if his characters still haunt your dreams, leave a tribute in his honor. Because Anthony Hopkins is not only an actor we admire, he is a testament that against all odds, life itself can still be lived with grace.